town of Elms Ridge was nothing but heat and dust the day the cowboy returned. Wind carved through the crooked main street, tossing grit against sun-bleached signs and shuttered windows. The town had grown quieter in the years since he'd last passed through, or maybe just meaner. He rode in slow, hat low over his eyes, the same way you walk through a graveyard, not for fear, but out of respect. Near the stock pens the crowd had gathered, not for cattle, not this time. There, on the raised wooden platform where animals were usually haggled for and handed off, stood three girls, silent, pale, their dresses clean but threadbare, hair tied back as if for church. A rusted bell rang out once. The auction began. They were sisters. You could see it in the shape of their mouths, the stillness in their eyes. The eldest stood straight, defiant. The middle one looked only at the ground. The youngest twisted a rag doll between her fingers, her lips moving in a whisper meant only for the wind. Their father watched from the side, coat open, boots dusted, face unreadable. He took the money without flinching. The cowboy said nothing. When the last bid echoed out, the crowd began to thin. Men shook hands, led horses away, spoke in low voices. The girls were gone, divided like cattle between wagons. The dust settled, and still the cowboy sat on his horse watching. By sunset, he was gone too. But 2 days later, 3 wagons were found abandoned. One overturned, one emptied, one still with the fire burning. The girls were missing, and in the corner of each wagon, nailed into wood or pressed into dirt, was the same mark, a single silver star, and the print of a riding boot beneath it. They didn't see him coming, not the man who bought the eldest, nor the one who dragged the middle girl across 2 counties in silence. The third never even reached her new home. All that remained of those buyers were rumors: a burnt jacket found hanging from a fence, a mule returning alone, a man who went into the hills and never came back. But the land remembered. It always did. He moved like drought, slow, dry, and inevitable. No one heard his voice, only the sound of his spurs echoing off canyon walls, or the flick of reins in the dark before dawn. The way his silhouette would appear, just before vanishing into heat shimmer. And with him, one by one, the girls returned. First the youngest, asleep in his arms when he rode into the ghost town of Dry Hollow. The townsfolk watched as he lifted her down, her doll still in her lap, and carried her into the abandoned chapel. She never cried. She just watched the flame flicker on the candle he lit, as if she had known all along he would come. Then the middle one, walking beside his horse 2 days later, barefoot, silent, her face streaked with ash. They shared a single canteen, and she never looked back, even when the sheriff rode past them with questions in his throat and warnings in his eyes. The eldest took the longest. She had fought, escaped, hidden. She had blood on her sleeves, not hers. And when he found her, she didn't recognize him until she did. Then she didn't speak, just climbed behind him, arms around his waist, and they vanished into the hills. By the time they reached the cabin, hidden miles from the nearest trail, the sisters had changed, not back to who they were, but into something else, something harder, quieter. He gave them the room with the wide window and mended the shutters with iron nails. He chopped wood, caught rain, left food at the table and fire in the stove. Still, he said nothing, because he knew the West didn't care what a man said, only what he did. The cabin sat in a fold of land where the hills bent low, hidden by cottonwoods and forgotten tracks. It wasn't much. 1 room and a loft, walls patched with old newspaper and burlap. But it held warmth, and more importantly, no one knew it was there. The girls slept for days, not from comfort, but exhaustion, a kind that went beyond the body. In their dreams, they still heard wagons creak and hands pull. But in the waking silence of that place, the ghosts had no names. The cowboy rose before the sun each day. He cooked in silence, set tin bowls by the stove. The food was plain: beans, salt meat, bread scorched on the pan. But it was steady. It said, "You are here and you are fed." They never asked why he brought them back, and he never said. Instead, he built small things: a bench beneath the porch, a second cot, then a third. He fixed the cracked window, strung wire for laundry, laid stones to shape a path through the dust. Sometimes he left at dawn and returned at nightfall, coat smelling of sage and horses, blood dried on his knuckles. The girls never asked where he went, but they watched him more closely each time he came home, as if measuring what pieces of him were lost out there and what still remained. One evening, the youngest placed her doll on the bench he'd made, left it there, like an offering. That night, he carved 3 names into the beam above the hearth, not their real names, not the ones they'd been born with or sold under. Names that had weight only in that cabin, names they could choose to outgrow. The middle girl traced the letters with her finger the next morning, slow and careful, as if trying to understand what they meant. Outside, the wind blew hard. The world somewhere out there still turned cruelly. But inside, for the first time, there was something fragile growing. Not safety, not yet, but the shape of it. They came at dawn, as riders always did, with hooves thundering down the dry ridge, their shapes breaking the horizon like vultures circling a carcass. 5 of them, maybe 6. Dust masked their faces, but not their purpose. They weren't lawmen. They were thinner than law, hungrier, and rode like men paid not to ask questions, the kind who didn't knock. The cowboy saw them first, from where he stood by the creek, washing the tin plates with sand. His horse, tethered in the shade, snorted once, not in alarm but in memory. The animal knew the smell of danger, knew it was back. He didn't rush, just rose, dried his hands on his coat, and walked back toward the cabin. Inside, the girls had already gathered. The eldest stood by the window with her jaw clenched. The middle one gripped a wooden spoon like a weapon. The youngest sat still, staring at the floor. They had known it couldn't last. Peace in the West never did. The cowboy stepped in, crossed to the corner, and took his rifle from the hooks he had carved into the wall weeks ago. He didn't speak, just looked at them. One, then the next, then the last. That was enough. The riders dismounted with the ease of men who had killed before breakfast. One spat, another checked his revolver. They circled the cabin like coyotes around a wounded deer. Then, silence. No demand, no call. Just the sound of a match striking, a cigarette hissing to life. Waiting, daring someone to breathe. Inside, time thickened. The cowboy moved to the door, opened it wide. He didn't raise the rifle. He simply stood there, back straight, eyes calm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the youngest girl walked up beside him, slipped her hand into his. The men outside paused, because this wasn't what they'd expected. Not a man guarding property, but a man standing with something he claimed not out of greed, but out of defiance. In the stillness, one of the riders shifted. His finger twitched. The cowboy's eyes never moved. And in that moment, they knew. He had already made peace with whatever was coming. They didn't fire. Not that morning. Something in the cowboy's stillness, the way he stood between the girls and the wide, cruel world, gave even hired men pause. The West knew killers, but it feared those with nothing left to lose and something left to protect. The riders held their ground for a long breath. Then another. One of them, the youngest maybe, nudged his horse back a step. Dust swirled. Another cursed under his breath. The leader squinted at the cabin, eyes narrowing not in fear, but calculation. This wasn't over, but it wasn't today. Slowly they turned their mounts. One by one they rode off the way they'd come, silent, bitter, with the taste of unfinished business in their mouths. The cabin stood behind them, unbroken, watching. Inside, the girls waited. The eldest kept her hand on the window frame, unmoving until the last hoofbeat faded. The middle girl placed the spoon gently on the table. The youngest still held the cowboy's hand, though now it trembled. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. No words, just that. By afternoon, the wind rose again, a storm brewing far off, beyond the dry riverbeds and broken fences. The desert always remembered its thirst. That night, the cowboy worked in silence. He reinforced the door, packed dried meat into oilskin, checked the rifle, then another, tied extra blankets behind the saddle. He knew those men would return. Maybe not the same ones, but others. The west was wide, but its shadows traveled fast, and the scent of defiance lingered. The girls didn't ask questions, but they packed too, folded what little they had into cloth bundles. Not because they feared leaving, but because they finally understood. The man who saved them was still at war with the world, but now he wasn't alone. In the dark, the youngest curled beside the hearth, doll pressed to her chest. The middle one took the cot by the wall. The eldest sat by the window, eyes on the distant hills. And the cowboy sat near the door, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind change. It wasn't peace, but it was the shape of something close. They rode at dawn, away from the hills, the cabin fading behind them like a half-remembered dream. Dust clung to their clothes, and the girls said nothing. They had learned the silence of long rides, the way the wind erased questions, the way the sun burned away what didn't matter. The cowboy led, his horse steady and unhurried. The trail was narrow, carved along dry ridges and thorn brush. He avoided roads, crossed dry creeks, followed the paths only animals remembered. He was taking them somewhere the riders might not follow. By the second day, their canteens were half empty. The eldest girl's hands were blistered from gripping reins too long. The youngest slept in the saddle, her head against the cowboy's back. The middle one watched the horizon like she expected it to rise up and strike. On the third day, the desert gave way to the town of Belmark, a place of weathered porches, low voices, and eyes that didn't meet yours unless they had to. Belmark didn't welcome strangers, especially not ones like them. They stopped at the edge of town. The cowboy dismounted and handed his reins to the eldest girl. Then he walked into the heart of it, boots echoing on dry boards, coat stiff with dust, rifle slung across his back. He went to the store first, then the feed barn, then the saloon. He spoke little, showed silver, bought only what he needed: beans, bullets, medicine, cloth for new dresses. At each stop, men stared. Whispers followed him like heat on his shoulders. They knew him, some by name, others by what he'd done. They didn't ask questions, but their silence said more than words. He wasn't wanted, not anymore. At the last door, the sheriff's office, he paused, stood in the doorway long enough to be seen, long enough to be remembered. Then he turned and walked out. Back at the edge of town, the girls waited. The eldest didn't ask. The middle one looked at the sack of supplies and the fresh canteen. The youngest opened her hand to reveal a strip of red cloth, torn from the hem of a curtain. She hadn't spoken, but she had taken something. That night, they camped a mile out, by a dry well in the bones of a windmill. Coyotes cried in the dark. The stars stretched above them, sharp as glass. The cowboy sat beside the fire, turning the strip of red cloth in his hand. He didn't sleep. Neither did the eldest. The wind shifted on the seventh night, not in strength, but in direction. It carried the smell of mesquite and the faint tang of ash. The girls didn't notice, but the cowboy did. He stood at the edge of the firelight, staring out into the darkness, like a man waiting for a storm he could feel but not see. His rifle lay nearby, within reach but untouched. Some enemies didn't come with guns. Some came with memory. They had traveled far, through red rock canyons, sun-cracked riverbeds, past towns that only whispered their names to travelers passing through. The world was wide, but somehow still too small to outrun the past. The youngest girl had begun to hum again. Not songs, but small sounds. Half-forgotten melodies from a time before wagons and numbers and silence. The middle one braided a length of horsehair into a bracelet. The eldest sharpened a broken knife with slow, steady strokes. The cowboy watched them all. That night, as the fire fell low, he took a piece of driftwood and placed it in the coals. When it flared, he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth, worn, stained with years of sweat and dust. He unwrapped it slowly. It was a photograph, black and white, creased a dozen ways. A woman unsmiling, a child on her lap, small, pale, with the same eyes as the youngest girl. The girls leaned closer. He didn't stop them. He placed the photo in the fire. It curled quickly, edges blackening, face warping. But for a moment, just a moment, the woman in the image seemed to move, as if something in her refused to go quietly. Then she was ash. The cowboy sat back. His face gave away nothing. But in that silence, the girls understood something they hadn't before. He had lost more than he'd saved. He wasn't rescuing them out of mercy. He was reclaiming something. Maybe the shape of his daughter, or the weight of not being too late. The eldest girl, who hadn't spoken a word since the cabin, stood and walked to the fire. She held out her hand. He looked at her, and for the first time she said her name. Not the one she'd been given, not the one sold at auction, but the name she chose. A new one. He nodded once. The next morning she rode at his side, no longer as cargo or a burden, but as someone who had seen fire and refused to turn away. The trail turned east, then broke into open plains, tall grass swaying like waves beneath a gunmetal sky. For 2 days they saw no other soul, just hawks circling high, and the tracks of deer that vanished into the brush before anyone could glimpse their eyes. Then came the man in the white hat. He stood alone beside a fence post that had long since lost its wire, his boots dusty, hands empty. His coat was fine, too fine for the land, and his horse, tethered behind him, was restless in the wind. The cowboy slowed. The girls rode up behind him, the youngest half asleep against the saddle horn, the middle one clutching the reins too tightly, and the eldest now watching the horizon like it owed her something. They said nothing. The man in the white hat raised his hand in greeting. The cowboy did not return it. They knew each other. That much was clear. No words passed between them. Just long looks, the kind men share when they bury things together, or left them unburied. After a while, the man stepped aside. Not out of fear, but respect. The cowboy nodded once, then led the horses on. The girls didn't look back, but they felt something pass between the two men, an unfinished sentence or a warning carried on the wind. Later, when they made camp near a crooked tree and the scent of rain drifted from the east, the eldest asked quietly, "Who was he?" The cowboy didn't answer, but in the firelight, his jaw clenched in a way that told her enough. An hour after midnight, the youngest girl woke from a nightmare, her breath ragged, hands curled into fists. The cowboy didn't speak. He simply wrapped her in his coat and held her near the fire until she slept again. But his eyes never left the plains. The man in the white hat hadn't followed. Not yet. But men like him didn't need to follow. They waited for others to circle back, to stumble, to come looking for shelter. The cowboy knew, because once, long ago, he had worn a white hat too. They found it on the 10th day, a ruin tucked into the side of a bluff, where red rock bent like folded hands. The wind had stripped the paint from its bones long ago. The windows were hollow, like the sockets of an animal picked clean by time. And there were no doors, only gaps where hinges once held firm. But the wall still stood, and the roof, patched by stone and the grace of luck, held back the sky. The cowboy dismounted first, walking through the threshold like a man stepping into a grave he once escaped. He stood in the center of the room for a long while, staring at the hearth, at the marks on the floor, the child's scrawl etched into one wooden beam. This place had once been lived in, then abandoned, then forgotten. The girls moved through it slowly, like ghosts uncertain they belonged. The eldest swept out the leaves and windblown dirt. The middle girl found a tin cup, rusted but whole. The youngest crouched beneath a broken table and whispered something no one heard. They stayed 3 nights. In that time, the cowboy rebuilt one of the door frames, not to close the house off, but to remind it where protection should have been. He nailed canvas across the window holes, repaired the chimney, lit the first fire that hearth had known in a decade. On the second night, the eldest girl found an old dress folded in a trunk, pale blue with lace too fine for dust. It had belonged to a girl not unlike herself once. She wore it to the fire without shame. No one spoke of it, but the cowboy's eyes softened. He set out traps that evening, not for game, but for men. A string of cans, buried snares, branches snapped and reset to warn of footsteps. He had grown used to motion. Stillness made him wary. On the third night it rained, not the kind that washes clean, but the kind that turns dust into mud and memories into ache. Thunder rolled across the plains like a warning from God himself. They stayed dry mostly, wrapped in blankets beside a fire that flickered but never died. The cowboy sat in the doorway all night, rifle across his knees. The rain couldn't touch him, but something in the way he stared into the dark said that what hunted them now wasn't just men. It was guilt, and it rode faster than any horse ever could. On the morning after the rain, the world seemed quieter, as if the storm had swallowed the usual sounds of the plains, the call of distant birds, the whisper of the wind through the grass. Inside the house without doors, the air hung heavy with secrets. The cowboy moved carefully across the creaking floorboards, his boots stirring the thin layer of dust that settled from years of neglect. The girls followed silently, their eyes wide as they explored corners where shadows clung like old regrets. It was the youngest who found it, a loose board near the hearth, worn smooth by time and forgotten footsteps. She knelt and pried it gently, revealing a narrow cavity beneath the floor. Inside lay a folded piece of yellowed paper, brittle at the edges but intact. The cowboy took the letter, fingers trembling just enough to betray the stoic mask he wore like armor. He unfolded it slowly, revealing neat handwriting that seemed impossibly delicate in contrast to the harsh world outside. The girls gathered close, but no one spoke. The letter was meant for someone who had long since vanished from their lives. A name crossed out, a promise written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Lines spoke of regret, of love lost, of debts unpaid, and the hope that forgiveness might one day find a way. The cowboy's eyes darkened as he read, a silence settling over the room like dust. For the first time, the walls seemed to hold their breath. The youngest girl reached out and touched his hand, a silent plea for understanding. He nodded, folding the letter with care, tucking it inside his coat. It was a key, not to a door, but to the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering the last dry leaves across the porch. The house without doors had just opened one. The afternoon sun bled low over the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows that crawled across the dry earth like restless spirits. The cowboy and the girls packed what little they could carry, knowing that staying meant waiting for ghosts, both living and dead. The youngest held the cowboy's hand tightly, her eyes reflecting the firelight from the night before, the letter still folded safe in his coat. The eldest secured the saddlebags, her fingers tracing the rough seams as if memorizing the weight of their past. The middle girl scanned the distant hills, where a column of dust rose like a dark promise against the burning sky. The riders were coming back. They had no choice. The cowboy mounted his horse last, his gaze fixed ahead, past the barren mesas, beyond the cracked riverbeds where the world stretched out, indifferent and infinite. As they rode, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and impending rain. The girls fell silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. The silence of waiting, of fearing, of hoping. Behind them, the house without doors stood empty, a monument to what they had lost and what they dared still to protect. Ahead, the dust cloud grew, and the shadows moved closer. The sun dipped low, turning the sky blood red as the riders closed in like vultures circling prey. The cowboy tightened his grip on the reins, his jaw set like iron. The girls flanked him, silent sentinels hardened by loss, eyes sharp as knives. They reached a narrow canyon, the only place where the land squeezed close enough to force a fight. The cowboy dismounted, setting his rifle on the dusty ground. The girls followed, moving with a quiet resolve that betrayed the weight they carried. The riders came into view, silhouetted against the dying light, faces hard and merciless. No words were exchanged. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Gunfire erupted, sharp and sudden, echoing off the canyon walls. Dust rose, mixing with the smoke and the scent of spent gunpowder. The cowboy moved like a shadow, steady and unyielding, shielding the girls with every breath. When the last shot faded, silence fell, heavy and complete. The riders lay still, their threat ended. The cowboy turned to the girls, faces streaked with dirt and determination. In the fading light, they were no longer victims. They were survivors. And the west was a little less cold. The dust settled like a slow sigh over the canyon floor. The wounded wind whispered through the narrow cracks in the rocks, carrying the echoes of gunfire and fading pain. The cowboy sat against a stone, his rifle resting nearby but forgotten for the moment. The girls gathered close, their faces worn but unbroken. The eldest cradled a scraped hand. The middle adjusted the blankets wrapped around the youngest, who shivered despite the heat. No words passed between them, only the heavy silence of souls stitched together by grief and defiance. The sky darkened, stars blinking awake in the vast open sky. The desert stretched endlessly, cold and beautiful, indifferent to their survival. The cowboy looked up, tracing constellations that had once guided him home, or perhaps away from it. He sighed, a breath carrying more than just tiredness, regret, hope, a fragile promise. The girls leaned into him, their presence a quiet reminder that even in the harshest land, life persisted. Tomorrow they would move again, chase freedom, or whatever semblance of peace the West allowed. But tonight, they rested in the fragile comfort of stillness. Dawn broke soft and gray over the endless plains, stretching light across cracked earth and twisted sagebrush. The cowboy stirred, waking before the girls. He watched the sun climb, painting the sky with muted fire, a promise and a warning both. The eldest was already up, folding blankets with practiced care. The middle packed their sparse belongings. The youngest sat quietly, tracing circles in the dirt, her eyes distant but steady. They moved like shadows at first light, steady and unhurried, each step a refusal to be swallowed by the past. The trail ahead was long and uncertain, a ribbon of dust and memory winding through hills and forgotten towns. The cowboy didn't speak, but the girls felt it, the weight of what they carried, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the West could be kinder than it seemed. They rode into the morning, wind lifting their dust behind them like a ghostly banner. No promises were made, no words needed, just the road forward. The sun hung low, a dying ember sinking beneath the horizon. The sky blazed with shades of amber and violet, the final light spilling over the endless plains like a benediction. The cowboy and the girls paused on a ridge, silhouetted against the vastness. Behind them, the world they left, the dust, the pain, the silent sacrifices. Before them, only the open land and the promise of something new. The eldest looked back once, her eyes reflecting a sorrow too deep for words. The middle reached out, taking her sister's hand, a tether in a sea of uncertainty. The youngest, quiet and pale, leaned into the cowboy's side, seeking the warmth of a protector who had become more than a stranger. He said nothing. He never had to. In the silence, there was understanding. They were no longer lost, no longer sold, no longer alone. As twilight folded into night, the wind carried their story across the West, a story of pain, redemption, and the fragile, stubborn light of hope. The last light was theirs.